What if I told you that the fall of Berlin didn't end with surrender, but with silence? That beneath the ashes of the Reichstag and the rubble of Adolf Hitler's bunker, the Allies uncovered something so disturbing, so unexplainable, that even hardened Soviet generals refused to speak of it publicly. Most people think the war ended with Hitler's suicide, a few desperate Nazi broadcasts, and the raising of the red flag over Berlin. But the real final chapter didn't happen on the streets. It happened underneath them. After Berlin collapsed in May 1945, the Soviets took full control of the city's underground, not just subways and bunkers, but a buried empire of tunnels, sealed doors, and laboratories no civilian had ever entered. It started with reports from soldiers, strange sounds beneath their boots, warm pockets of air under collapsed buildings, and Soviet demolition crews that entered certain sectors and never came back out. Stalin immediately ordered the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to block off entire zones, arrest curious engineers, and keep the Western Allies out of what he called the root of the snake. But whispers spread fast. And soon, American and British intelligence began hearing the same chilling phrase from multiple defectors. They were building something under Berlin, not weapons, not bunkers, something worse. What the Soviets found wasn't a conventional arsenal. Beneath Berlin, buried in reinforced vaults and flooded corridors, was what appeared to be a maze of biological chambers, medical files written in code, and sealed labs lined with incinerators. But this wasn't just Nazi science. It was science no one claimed. Entire rooms were filled with artificial limbs that didn't match any known uniform, morgues filled with mismatched body parts, and crates marked with symbols never used by the Wehrmacht, SS, or Luftwaffe. Some Soviet commanders believed it was a secret research wing of the unearthed, the Nazi occult division. Others insisted it was a rogue offshoot of Unit 731, transported from Japan. But one thing was clear. This was not meant to be found, and what terrified the Soviets the most wasn't what they discovered. It was what was missing. In one chamber beneath Tiergarten, they found a rusted cage the size of a subway car, scorched from the inside. Near it, a steel operating table bolted to the floor, still warm. Nearby, documents written in archaic German dialects described Phase 4 human reversals, and referenced subjects who could withstand vacuum, speak posthumously, and see through heat. It sounded like nonsense, until they found a preserved human head, the vocal cords removed, the eyes intact, and the inner ear wired into a black mechanical shell. The Americans demanded access. The Soviets denied it. Within 72 hours, that section of Berlin was sealed off by Red Army engineers. Cement was poured into the entrances. Maps were redrawn. And when questioned by Western officials, Soviet commanders claimed it was unstable terrain. But behind the scenes, Stalin ordered the materials, everything from human remains to scorched documents, to be flown back to Moscow under NKVD guard. A senior Soviet doctor reportedly collapsed after examining the samples, saying only, they weren't trying to win the war, they were trying to become something else. And he wasn't alone. Years later, declassified American files revealed that even Allied prisoners of war who had escaped Berlin in 1944 spoke of ghost trains, underground transport carts that moved without tracks, humming like turbines, ferrying unknown cargo to sealed vaults under Tempelhof. These reports were dismissed at the time, but after 1945, too many lined up with what Soviet scouts claimed, that the Nazis had dug a second Berlin beneath the first, a place not just of defense, but transformation. British intelligence, obsessed with Nazi technology, created a secret file named Operation Echo. Its objective was to intercept anything the Soviets pulled from Berlin's underground. One of the few photographs recovered, heavily redacted, shows a crate labeled KR-33/Lastiva, containing what appears to be an embryonic form suspended in black fluid. The photo was marked, "Do not open under any condition." That file was buried until the 1990s. and even then, several pages remain sealed. But here's where the story gets colder. In 1947, a Soviet train derailed in the Urals. The cargo it was carrying was listed as industrial waste, but when locals arrived before the army did, they found hundreds of metal cylinders leaking a thick, dark substance, and inside some, things that looked like human tissue, but too pale, too stretched, too smooth. Survivors described one piece as a head without a mouth. All of it was burned by Soviet troops on site. Officially, it never happened. But the pattern was there, and it led to a question no one wanted to answer. What were the Nazis building beneath Berlin, and where did it go after the fall? Some believe it was nothing more than underground weapons testing. Others, like a few bold historians, believe it was the foundation of a post-human program, something beyond war, something meant to erase weakness, morality, and even death. One Russian defector claimed the Soviets found something alive, not fully human, not fully machine. He was discredited, but the way his body was found weeks later, mouth sealed shut, documents missing, only fueled the mystery. Today, Berlin's rebuilt streets cover that darkness. Tourists walk above it. Trains ride where ghost carts once ran. But the Soviets never spoke again about what they saw beneath Berlin. And when Stalin's private journal was released, one line stood out. Scribbled in a margin, it read, "Berlin was never a capital, it was a cocoon." In the weeks that followed the discovery beneath Berlin, Soviet command became more paranoid than ever before. General Vasily Chuikov, who had led the final charge into the city and raised the red flag over the Reichstag, suddenly stopped giving interviews. His journals, which had been meticulously written for months during the Battle of Berlin, ended abruptly 2 days after the bunker raids. His final sentence read, "We've uncovered more than we defeated." What that meant, no one knew. But something changed. Red Army engineers were seen constructing what witnesses called black walls, thick concrete barriers inside old subway lines, often covered at night and surrounded by armed guards. Some walls had no doors, others were sealed with molten steel. These weren't just fortifications, they were containment. And the question was, containment of what? Rumors spread among Soviet troops. One told his brother, years later, that the men who entered the Tiergarten tunnels wore special masks, not for gas, but for sound. They weren't afraid of poison, he said. They were afraid of hearing something. Another soldier swore he heard voices underground, repeating numbers in reverse. When questioned by his commander, he was sedated and transferred east. He was never seen again. Meanwhile, British and American officers stationed in the western half of Berlin noticed strange power surges, underground detonations that were never explained. The Soviets claimed they were destroying unexploded munitions, but the tremors came every third night. Exactly at 3:33 a.m. It wasn't random, it was ritual. By late 1945, intelligence services in London and Washington began receiving intercepted Soviet communications, marked with the codename NIXZERO. That name appeared in memos related to captured Nazi research projects, particularly those tied to human experimentation and consciousness mapping. The strangest part? Nix Zero wasn't in Russian, it was in German, and the only known usage of that term before was in a single Gestapo document discovered in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, describing a file to be burned upon Hitler's death. But someone preserved it, and someone used it. One American OSS agent, posing as a Red Cross liaison, managed to photograph blueprints found inside a bombed-out building near Anhalter Bahnhof. The prints showed a 3-tiered complex underground, with one level marked Schattenkörperkammer, shadow body chamber. That same night, the building was firebombed again, not by Nazis, but by Soviet trucks carrying thermite. Why destroy what was already destroyed, unless someone had seen too much? By 1946, Soviet diplomats stopped attending Allied debriefs related to Nazi research. Every time Berlin's underground was mentioned, their answers became shorter. One simply said, "That part of Germany is no longer yours." But cracks kept forming. In an abandoned corridor near Hermannplatz, a French engineer on post-war cleanup discovered a sealed shaft. Inside was a room filled with small glass boxes, each one containing a single eyeball suspended in liquid, wired to electrodes, all of them staring straight up. No notes, no names, just a single symbol on the wall, a downward-pointing triangle, surrounded by 7 dots. That symbol would later appear in Soviet archives, in files related to psychological warfare. What terrified the Western Allies was that none of these discoveries matched Nazi records. Not even the most meticulous SS documents mentioned the tunnels beneath Berlin. It was as if they were never built, but they existed, and someone had planned them. A U.S. military geologist tasked with mapping underground fault lines wrote in his report, "The tunnel system is older than the city above it." He was dismissed. But in 1991, when Soviet archives began to leak, one note surfaced. It simply said, "Pre-Berlin structures confirmed." Unaligned with Nazi architecture, possibly ancient. Whether true or misinterpreted, it begged the question, did the Nazis build these chambers, or did they find them? A German woman, now elderly, came forward in the 1990s to recount a story her father had told her. He worked as an electrician for the SS. In 1943, he was sent to an underground site labeled Project Lebensbrücke, Project Life Bridge. He returned after 2 weeks, pale, trembling, and nearly mute. When she asked what he saw, he only whispered, "They're trying to bring something back, but it's not human anymore." Then he made her promise never to repeat it. She didn't, until he died. The Allies, decades later, would hear fragments of that same phrase in intercepted East German transmissions. Bring it back. Not human, and always, always, the same silence from the Soviets. Even when confronted in the UN, Russian officials denied any post-war research tied to Berlin's underground, but they never denied that something was sealed there. In 1956, a Soviet journalist named Ivan Marenko published a fictionalized story about a man who enters a Berlin tunnel and finds a chamber where mirrors reflect people who aren't there. It was banned, not because of politics, but because of unauthorized architectural descriptions. Marenko disappeared a year later. His apartment was found abandoned, and one sentence was carved into his wall: "The voices are learning German now." Whether a hoax or something darker, it added to the legacy that something beneath Berlin wasn't finished. Even today, certain areas of the Berlin U-Bahn are permanently closed, with vague reasons like structural hazard or low usage, but satellite scans show geometric formations beneath them, too straight, too symmetrical. Files still remain classified, survivors remain silent, but the story continues, whispered by those who've seen too much, and denied by those who know exactly what was left behind. Because maybe what terrified the Soviets wasn't a machine or a weapon, maybe it was something that couldn't be killed in war, something that waited for silence, something that survived and listened, and maybe it still does. As Cold War tensions escalated, the mystery beneath Berlin didn't vanish. It deepened. What had begun as a wartime scramble to scavenge Nazi tech quietly morphed into a silent arms race. A race of biological intelligence and psychological warfare. By 1948, Soviet research compounds in Siberia began receiving shipments labeled Arzama 6/Berlin origin. The items inside? Unknown. The paperwork? Forged. But British codebreakers monitoring intercepted transmissions noticed a terrifying pattern. All shipments were routed to facilities with bioatmospheric containment protocols, something typically reserved for radioactive or infectious material. But these weren't nuclear weapons. These were biological entities. At least, that's what the whispers claimed. One Soviet scientist, Dr. Alexei Voronov, defected in 1953 and testified before a NATO intelligence panel. His words were dismissed as delusion until two members of that panel abruptly resigned and vanished from public life. According to Voronov, Stalin's team didn't just find files in Berlin. They found a subject. He referred to it only as the quiet one. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a machine. It was a human-adjacent figure, recovered from a sealed unit beneath a former Hitler Youth Training Center, still alive, still breathing, and completely unresponsive to stimuli, except sound. Voronov claimed it only reacted to a single frequency, 7 Hz, not audible to humans. But when that frequency was triggered, it blinked, its pupils contracted, and its mouth, which had no vocal cords, opened. That was enough for Stalin. The Soviets packed it in a steel container and sent it to Arzamas. The guards assigned to the train were replaced every 2 hours. No one saw what was inside. But when the train arrived, 2 guards were missing, and one had gouged out his ears. The official explanation? Radiation stress. But internal reports, later leaked, suggested a different reality. The guards hadn't gone mad. They had started speaking in languages they'd never studied. Ancient German, Old Latin, one even uttered phrases from the Enochian tongue, a language constructed in the 16th century and used in occult rituals. These reports were buried, but in the West, similar tremors were surfacing. American OSS agents stationed in Germany began reporting strange seismic pulses beneath Berlin. Again, always at 3:33 a.m., engineers ruled out trains. No activity was logged, and British MI6 agents, attempting to tunnel into Soviet-occupied Berlin during Operation Gold, struck a section of steel-reinforced earth they couldn't drill through. The soil was laced with an unknown metallic substance. When samples were sent back to London, they vanished en route. The lab technician assigned to the analysis was later found dead, electrocuted in a room with no power. By now, Allied command had begun to suspect that Berlin's true treasure wasn't gold, or missiles, or scientists. It was something else entirely, something Stalin was willing to bury the Cold War to protect. In 1958, a covert CIA unit codenamed Operation Duskwell was launched under direct orders from President Eisenhower. Its mission? Track every piece of intelligence related to Berlin's underground structures. Duskwell agents traced Soviet construction equipment to former Nazi medical bunkers, now sealed with concrete and listed as collapsed zones. But an ex-SS logistics officer who was captured during the Nuremberg trials, revealed that many of those bunkers weren't destroyed. They were never mapped to begin with. In fact, entire sectors of Berlin were omitted from Allied bombing runs because German officers labeled them civilian no-target zones. But when Allied teams returned post-war, those zones were empty. No civilians, no buildings, just shafts leading underground. One American intelligence memo from 1960 described the area under Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church as anomalous. Ground-penetrating radar picked up a cavernous dome 300 feet below street level. When excavation was proposed, Berlin authorities denied the request, citing geological instability. But a week later, 2 civilians, amateur explorers, entered a manhole in that district and never returned. Their bodies were found days later, miles away, beneath the Soviet zone. Their skin was intact, but their eyes were completely missing. No incisions, no blood, just absence. Western analysts called it a message. The Soviets never acknowledged the deaths, and construction continued above the site as if nothing had happened. Back in Moscow, Voronov's warnings about the Quiet One were labeled disinformation, but internally, the KGB increased funding to a program called Kolos, a branch focused not on weapons, but on perception. Specifically, could human consciousness be weaponized? Could memory be extracted, injected, or replicated? Documents recovered after the fall of the Soviet Union show that Kolos tested over 300 subjects, with residual material taken from Berlin. Of those 300, only 3 survived. All three went mute. One tore out her tongue. Another painted the same image over and over, a mouth with no face. The third, he simply pointed at a map to Berlin and whispered, "It still hears." That phrase became the obsession of Duskwell agents in the 1970s. They believed the Quiet One, or what remained of it, had not been destroyed. In fact, satellite footage from 1973 captured a Soviet convoy entering an unmarked facility in northern Kazakhstan. The footage, enhanced decades later, revealed the symbol from the Tiergarten tunnels, the triangle with 7 dots. And for the first time, Western intelligence accepted a possibility they had denied for years. Berlin had been more than a battlefield. It had been a laboratory, not just for war, but for something older, something deeper. The Cold War, in many ways, became a race not for technology, but for silence, to keep what was found buried, to keep the question unanswered. But every wall cracked eventually, every secret leaks, and the echoes from beneath Berlin, they never stopped. As the 1970s unfolded, Western intelligence agencies began to understand that whatever the Soviets had taken from Berlin was not merely historical or technological. It was experimental and ongoing. Analysis of intercepted satellite data revealed patterns in the construction sites across East Germany and parts of Central Asia. These locations were built with no strategic military logic, often placed far from supply lines, air defense networks, or population centers. Yet each site was equipped with underground vaults, thick radiation shielding, biometric locking mechanisms, and internal chambers lined with copper, quartz, and what was described in one Western file as sacrificial lead. The architectural layouts of these underground sites echoed earlier diagrams from Nazi facilities discovered beneath Berlin. Even though those layouts had never been made public, the match was mathematically precise. In London, a British intelligence task force quietly labeled these parallels under a new internal codename, Echo Vault. They believed these sites were built not to house a weapon, but to contain something unstable, something that needed both insulation from the outside world and extreme environmental control. Satellite temperature readings showed one consistent anomaly. Each Echo Vault maintained an interior temperature of 3.3 degrees Celsius, regardless of outside conditions, even in the Kazakh desert. This number was flagged by analysts, who realized it matched the temperature recorded in the Berlin Tiergarten tunnels during the first Allied survey, and again in the sealed medical wing beneath the Führer bunker. That specific figure was seen as unnatural, especially because cooling systems required to maintain it would have to operate beyond conventional capacity without being visible on thermal scans. In other words, the conditions were being preserved, not for comfort, but for biological or metaphysical stability. The CIA's internal science branch, in coordination with DARPA, initiated a backchannel project. Its goal: identify any corresponding phenomena on American soil or in captured Nazi archives. They found fragments of research indicating that Berlin had been part of a triangulated zone of experimental energy fields tested during 1943 and 1944. A network supposedly designed to displace the perceptual boundary between consciousness and physical memory. The files were incomplete, burned at the edges, water damaged, and typed on non-standard German typewriters, but they all pointed to a recurring phrase that haunted the analysts: the memory field is not location-bound. This suggested that the experiments conducted beneath Berlin were not tethered to the geography, only triggered by it, and that the effect could potentially be recreated elsewhere if conditions were correct. As that possibility surfaced, a new wave of fear emerged within NATO. Not fear of a new weapon, but fear of an uncontainable phenomenon, one that could follow its observers. Reports of unexplainable behavior among military personnel began to spike, especially in facilities with access to Berlin-era relics. Technicians handling recovered artifacts from Nazi medical bunkers complained of auditory hallucinations, migraines, or uncontrollable anxiety when exposed to certain materials, particularly documents printed with an unknown carbon compound, one that couldn't be dated by radiological methods. In two separate NATO facilities, one in Norway, the other in Canada, encrypted computers shut down after employees attempted to scan images of specific Berlin blueprints. The error logs didn't register a software crash. Instead, the logs showed the word echo repeated continuously until the memory storage failed. NATO's science division dismissed the events as sabotage, yet neither facility allowed the blueprint images to be uploaded again. Across the Atlantic, the Pentagon's secret archives revealed that the Berlin mystery had quietly become a top-tier containment concern. Multiple military think tanks were instructed to prepare hypothetical scenario maps in the event that what the Soviets had sealed might one day be exposed. One scenario, dated 1981, suggested that if the containment structure in Berlin's lower tunnels failed, it could trigger an uncontrollable wave of shared cognitive collapse, a mass event where populations within a certain radius would no longer be able to distinguish memory from physical space. While this theory seemed absurd on the surface, its credibility rose sharply when U.S. recon teams captured photographic evidence of Soviet scientists inside an underground Kyrgyzstan vault, performing what appeared to be mirroring rituals involving black liquid, rotating copper discs, and lightless chambers. These were not religious practices. They were repetitions, movements and patterns that reflected the original conditions beneath Berlin. Western analysts concluded that the Soviets were not merely storing something, they were replicating the environment where it was first awakened. Meanwhile, in East Berlin, unexplained electromagnetic interference began affecting civilian infrastructure. Power grids near the old bunker zones flickered with no cause. Tunnels that had once been accessible through U-Bahn extensions were bricked up without warning. Soviet soldiers stationed in those areas were rotated every 11 days, far shorter than standard deployments. Historians were denied access to archives regarding wartime Berlin hospitals. A German librarian reported that books referencing Project Dreh were forcibly removed from university libraries. That title, traced back to a damaged Wehrmacht invoice, was later associated with funding allocated to post-mortem consciousness harvesting. No official paper trail exists beyond that. The documents vanish or self-contradict. The subject headings are redacted, but the expenditures are real. They show steel imports, chemical shipments, and human transport requests that can't be accounted for in any known historical database. The secrecy extended even to East German civilians, many of whom remember areas of the city becoming silent zones, where birds didn't land and radios went dead. No explanations were ever given, no news reports filed, just the quiet, constant expansion of subterranean Berlin, deeper and darker with every year. By 1989, as the Berlin Wall began to fall, whispers of what lay beneath it began to rise, not from politicians, but from workers, men and women who had once been told to brick up tunnels, reinforce shafts, or pour cement into chambers they were forbidden to enter. One civil engineer confessed that he helped pour 400 tons of lead-reinforced concrete into a single chamber near Potsdamer Platz. He was never told what was behind the door, but the thickness of the wall they built, over 12 feet, was enough to shield a nuclear event. He asked no questions. He was promoted the next day, then disappeared from the records 6 months later. The Cold War had always been about two sides racing for dominance, but beneath that war, deeper than policy or ideology, there was another game. To see who could forget first, who could bury the truth deeper, and who would risk waking it again. Beneath Berlin, the war never truly ended. It only moved underground. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Western intelligence agencies raced to exploit the sudden vacuum, Berlin, which had once been a city split by a wall, now offered an open gate into the secrets the USSR had buried for nearly half a century. Declassified documents began surfacing, not from public archives, but from private hands, smugglers, defectors, and former operatives who understood the black market value of what they held. Among them were fragments of KGB field reports, architectural diagrams, and something far more disturbing, videotapes, grainy, distorted, and time-stamped between 1965 and 1984. The tapes appeared to document Soviet scientists conducting experiments in a subterranean facility marked only with the number 17. The interior matched no known Soviet base, but its door frames, wall materials, and tiled corridors precisely matched early 1940s German military architecture. Western analysts were stunned. The Soviets hadn't just copied Nazi designs, they had continued using the original Nazi locations. One tape showed a glass chamber with a human subject strapped upright, blinking rapidly as an oscillating tone, precisely 7 hertz, echoed through the chamber. The subject didn't speak. He wrote. Words appeared on the walls, not with ink, but condensation. They were phrases from ancient Babylonian cuneiform, according to analysts. Another tape showed a chamber where no personnel were visible, but the camera's position slowly shifted, as if moved by unseen hands. On-screen telemetry confirmed there were no vibrations in the room, no air movement, no heat signature. It was as if the camera itself had become self-aware. One final tape ended with its label burned off, but showed a Soviet officer entering a tunnel beneath Berlin and whispering a phrase picked up faintly on audio. It remembers. Whether it was a warning or a ritual, no one could tell. Meanwhile, in unified Germany, construction crews working near Spree Park unearthed a reinforced concrete shell buried 30 feet underground. It wasn't on any map, not even Soviet military schematics. Once breached, the chamber revealed a perfect hemisphere, polished obsidian walls, no doors, no markings, just a steel pedestal in the center, and atop it, an empty iron cradle bolted to the stone. A forensic team entered. Within 3 minutes, 2 collapsed from nausea. One began speaking in reverse German, repeating the name Elbereth over and over. The room was sealed within the hour and officially declared a natural gas hazard. But no gas was found, just abnormally high magnetic pulses, spiking in 11-minute intervals. NATO scientists flagged the location. 2 weeks later, the entire chamber collapsed in what was described as a structural anomaly, but satellite imaging showed no sinkhole, no tremor. The site simply flattened, as if erased. In parallel, NATO archives began comparing recovered Soviet documents with older Nazi blueprints, and a horrifying realization emerged. Hitler's original team of researchers hadn't just constructed bunkers and tunnels to escape bombings. They were mapping a network, a cognitive grid based not on physical geography, but on belief. Every major tunnel site aligned not with military logic, but with ancient Germanic ley lines, medieval plague routes, and sacred pagan sites long erased from public memory. Hitler's occult division, the Ahnenerbe, had known this, and the Soviets had uncovered their work beneath the Reichstag. They didn't destroy it. They expanded it. Files show that Stalin ordered his engineers to deepen the grid, not with explosives, but with manual excavation, fearing disruption of the current. The language used in the reports wasn't military, it was esoteric. They spoke of resonance fields, soul anchors, and atmospheric memory pressure. These weren't metaphors, they were equations, formulas drawn from both particle physics and mysticism. Equations that, when applied, resulted in measurable changes in perception among test subjects exposed to the field sites. Not hallucinations, synchronized visions. People separated by miles reported seeing the same symbols, hearing the same words, dreaming the same dreams. One German physicist, Dr. Markus Halber, later testified to a secret Bundestag committee that the Berlin Underground was no longer a physical structure, it was a containment field, not for technology, not for history, but for something he called a cognitive relic, a thing so saturated with collective memory, belief, death, and worship that it had become self-reinforcing, alive, in a sense not biological but informational, conscious not through neurons but through narrative density. And the Soviets, knowingly or not, had fed it with fear, blood, ritual, and repetition. This theory might have been dismissed as fringe, but in 1995, UN Special Archive 342-B was opened to review Cold War anomalies. Among the exhibits, a compass that spun uncontrollably within Berlin's defunct S-Bahn tunnels, audio logs of white noise recorded beneath Alexanderplatz that when slowed down contained Gregorian chants, and photographs of Soviet-era murals depicting cities overgrown not with plants, but with veins. By the early 2000s, urban explorers began leaking photos and maps of still-sealed areas beneath Berlin. Despite layers of concrete and warning signs, some claimed to hear rhythmic pulses, whispers in dead zones, or see reflections that didn't match their movements. All such accounts were dismissed as hoaxes or hallucinations, but NATO kept monitoring. Seismic activity beneath Berlin remained oddly regular, always peaking at 3:33 a.m. Atmospheric pressure in sealed tunnels fluctuated despite no air exchange, and magnetic anomalies remained unsolved. Berlin had been a capital, a battlefield, and a Cold War pawn. But beneath its streets, it had become something else entirely. A vault not just of history, but of memory, belief, and possibly a force mankind was never meant to uncover. The Allies had hoped the war ended in 1945, but the secrets buried there suggest otherwise. They suggest the war, the real one, never ended at all. It just went quiet. By the mid-2000s, NATO's classified psychological division, known internally as Echo Cell, began compiling a report titled Behavioral Disintegration among Containment Exposure Personnel. It was never meant for public eyes. The 312-page file detailed cases of intelligence agents, military engineers, and scientific observers who entered certain sectors beneath Berlin only to emerge fundamentally altered. Not wounded, not insane, but fragmented. Their memories misaligned, their speech patterns altered. Some referred to themselves in the third person for weeks. Others began to draw spiraling diagrams on every available surface. Napkins, shoes, their own skin, unable to explain what the symbols meant. One lieutenant, after a brief 47-minute excursion into Tunnel 4N, refused to wear shoes ever again, claiming the ground whispered best through the bone. He was found several months later, catatonic and surrounded by hundreds of Polaroid photos, each one taken inside his own apartment, each labeled with the time 3:33 a.m., despite being shot at various times of day. Another officer, a translator, lost the ability to speak her native tongue and began muttering in a hybrid of Germanic Latin and Old Church Slavonic, reciting what analysts later identified as fragments from the 9th century Codex Sangalensis. NATO attempted to isolate these anomalies by sealing off portions of the tunnels with lead-lined blast doors and Faraday cages, but the phenomena didn't stop. Some claimed the tunnels were expanding, that new corridors appeared overnight. Surveillance drones sent down to map the interiors would return with corrupted data, looped footage, or worse, video of places that didn't exist on any map, containing symbols not found in any known language. At one point, NATO considered flooding the entire network with concrete, but engineers warned that the volume required would exceed modern capacity. The tunnels were far deeper and more complex than previously believed. One NATO general, after reviewing a month of footage, made only one note in the margin of his report. "This isn't a structure, it's a wound." He retired the next day. What terrified intelligence agencies most wasn't what was seen, it was what was heard. Acoustic surveys in abandoned Soviet sections revealed continuous low-frequency murmurs, just below the range of human hearing. Yet the vibrations affected the heart rate of anyone standing nearby. Some began crying without knowing why. Others vomited. But when played backward and slowed, the murmurs revealed structured rhythms, like chanting, but not in any known human dialect. An experimental linguistics team from Norway attempted to parse it and concluded, with no irony, that the audio matched the mathematical patterning of mourning rituals, not in tone, in meaning. It was grief, structured grief, encoded in frequency. The belief among some researchers was growing that the Berlin Underground was not simply echoing the trauma of war, it was amplifying it, weaponizing it, and perhaps learning from it. By 2010, strange reports began seeping beyond NATO walls and into German press, not through official leaks, but through whispers on conspiracy forums, obscure university papers, and anonymous digital uploads. A shortwave radio enthusiast claimed to intercept directionless pings that followed the Berlin U-Bahn lines and echoed in Morse but spelled no words. A group of Berlin students live-streamed themselves entering a tunnel beneath the old Siemensbahn, only for the feed to go black after one of them began screaming about a man with no lips. They were found 2 days later in a drainage canal, confused, dehydrated, and unable to recall who they were. As fringe stories gained traction, the German government responded not with denial, but with urban development projects. Parks were expanded into sealed industrial zones. Entire subway extensions were canceled without explanation. A new National Museum exhibit on Berlin's war bunkers opened briefly, then shuttered indefinitely after a staff member had a seizure while cataloging a rusted medallion that no one recalled collecting. Internal Bundestag memos, later leaked by a whistleblower called Sturzengel, revealed that several agencies had proposed legalizing controlled demolitions in eastern Berlin, citing non-linear psychological saturation points in human population centers. Translation: they feared the memory itself was contagious. That exposure to the tunnels was enough to trigger not just trauma, but belief. And belief, in this context, was not harmless. It was fuel. People began reporting identical dreams, images of rotating obsidian pillars, children with reversed eyes, and red-sleeved officers speaking backward. These weren't internet hoaxes. The witnesses never knew each other. Across Berlin, architecture students, subway workers, and cleaning staff began describing the same structures, rooms that didn't exist on blueprints, doors behind ventilation shafts, stairs that led down 5 floors when the building only had 2. A coalition of German MPs requested a formal investigation in 2013, calling for transparency and psychological screening for workers assigned to the U-Bahn system. The request was denied. Privately, the government had already begun trials with psychological countermeasures, scent neutralization, magnetic balance bands, even experimental neural white noise injections, but none succeeded. In fact, several test subjects reported worsened effects. One participant began drawing circular maps of Berlin with no north, labeling each district by emotion instead of name: anger, grief, contempt, silence. When questioned, he simply said, "Why? That's how the city dreams now." What truly terrified the administration wasn't the conspiracy theories. It was the data. Emergency room reports across Berlin showed minor but consistent spikes in migraines, psychosis, and suicide attempts tied to specific nights, always aligned with the moon's waxing phase and always concentrated in neighborhoods closest to former Nazi tunnel zones. And though no official statement was released, one internal document, stamped Verschlusssache, classified, included a single haunting line beneath its data graphs. The wound is still open, and it wants to be seen. Outside of Germany, global powers were paying close attention, not publicly, but in private circles where ancient texts, psychological warfare, and Cold War intelligence intersected. The United States, in particular, had already compiled a hidden archive by the late 1990s. Codenamed Project Rookglass, it was run through DARPA's Behavioral Cognition Division. According to a leaked 2006 brief, American operatives had attempted limited exposure testing inside the Berlin tunnels using volunteers from the MKUltra aftermath, subjects already accustomed to trauma thresholds, but the results were catastrophic. One subject developed Capgras syndrome overnight, believing his reflection was alive, but his own body had already died. Another described Berlin not as a place, but as an organism with memory arteries. Of the 7 test cases, 5 were institutionalized, 2 went missing. The US quietly ended the project and flagged Berlin as an active cognitive zone. Across the Atlantic, British MI6 had its own history with the site. Declassified fragments from 1952 showed that British intelligence had once attempted to flood Tunnel 3Z using rerouted sewage, believing the Soviets were storing bioweapons, but the water didn't flood, it vanished, as if absorbed into something deeper. One MI6 technician suffered what was first assumed to be an embolism, but his autopsy revealed otherwise. His brain was intact, but the hippocampus was physically crystallized, a phenomenon no coroner could explain. The cause of death was listed simply as resonance trauma. The file was buried under Cold War secrecy, and then came the Vatican. For centuries, the Church had kept its own records of imprints, places where spiritual trauma became physical, like stigmata left on land. In 2011, Vatican archivists cross-referenced the Berlin anomalies with an obscure 14th century manuscript known as Codex Nocturnus, written by a German mystic who claimed that Berlin sat atop an unclosed tomb of breath, where the prayers of the dead echoed back. When church representatives visited Berlin to survey former Nazi sites, they returned with no public comment, but privately dispatched a sealed report to the papal curia. The title? Lux ex tenebris berlinensis, light from the darkness of Berlin. Within it, one line appeared repeatedly: do not wake the archive. Let the city forget. But that advice came too late. By 2015, international forums and whistleblower groups were documenting what they called the Berlin memory field. Patterns of neural interference, shared dreams, and psychic echo phenomena were spreading. Some cities with post-war Nazi architecture in South America, Eastern Europe, and even parts of North Africa began experiencing similar anomalies. This wasn't just Berlin anymore. Whatever had been built, buried, and bled into the ground in those final Nazi years had become something viral, not biological, not digital, but psychological, a form of transference, a memory so powerful it could imprint itself across borders, onto minds never meant to carry it. And the worst part? The origin was still unknown. Even Hitler's personal files never revealed what his occult engineers had truly discovered beneath Berlin. Stalin's men had expanded it. NATO had mapped it. But no one had yet understood it. Because you cannot understand something that doesn't live by reason, only by memory. By 2017, NATO's internal crisis files had reclassified Berlin's tunnel network from a non-lethal risk zone to a level black containment threat, the highest category, reserved for phenomena with potential cross-border psychological destabilization. That same year, a final attempt was authorized. It was never meant to be public. Codenamed Operation Stillglass, the mission was simple on paper: Insert a 5-man team of linguists, field psychologists, and thermal engineers into the sealed subchamber beneath what was once the Führer bunker perimeter. Their task was not exploration, it was to plant a multi-payload fusion concrete core, seal the internal structure at the atomic level, and record any cognitive drift data during the process. What wasn't shared with the operatives was a leaked pre-brief report from 2016. It stated that the Berlin anomaly had grown in frequency, not size, frequency, meaning the events weren't just spatial, they were happening more often, as if the memory embedded in the architecture was accelerating. The team entered at 3:12 a.m., Berlin time. Real-time feed was monitored from a mobile NATO command van 2 kilometers away. The first 19 minutes were smooth. Visual markers confirmed tunnel consistency, no physical anomalies. But at minute 20, the video feed began to jitter, not distort, just hesitate. Timecode revealed dropped seconds. Half frames began appearing in the lower edge of the video, blurred reflections of the team from angles not matching any camera on their suits. Then came the sound. Low, nearly inaudible, like ice cracking beneath a glacier. The lead operator, a specialist named Ethan Greaves, paused to adjust his audio relay. He reported no sound at all, yet command clearly recorded a background frequency oscillating at exactly 2.9 hertz, mimicking infrasonic levels known to trigger despair. At minute 34, Greaves said the tunnel began curving, even though visual GPS showed no deviation. He described the air as molten cold, and that each step felt like descending memory, not ground. At minute 41, the team lost all signal, not just audio, not just visual. Biometric readings flatlined, not to zero, but static, frozen as if paused. 23 hours later, the core detonated as programmed. The chamber collapsed, but when the debris was scanned, no trace of the operatives was found. Not blood, not gear, not even heat signatures embedded in the soil. The final recording, buried in a Level 5 classified NATO archive, contains only one phrase from Greaves, whispered at minute 39 before the system froze. It's not remembering us. It's waiting for someone else. Who that someone is, no agency, no government, no religion has dared to say aloud. But the city knows, Berlin knows, and beneath its feet, something once born in war, something sculpted by death, ritual, and memory, still breathes in the dark. With all formal excavation efforts halted, concrete poured, and digitally buried under layers of modern disinformation, only theories remain. But the theories themselves are enough to unsettle even the most rational historian. One of the most prominent, whispered through declassified Vatican fragments and Russian GRU transcripts, is that the Nazi architects beneath Berlin weren't building bunkers at all. They were building a machine, not one with gears and wires, but a spatial mechanism, an engineered topology of human memory, fear, and ritual, designed not to defend against war, but to summon something. Occult historians point to Heinrich Himmler's obsession with the world navel, an ancient esoteric concept describing a physical place where heaven, earth, and the underworld intersect. According to a 1942 SS memo, Hitler ordered psychogeographic alignment of the Berlin tunnel network with sites of ancient resonance. It's believed these were references to older burial grounds beneath Berlin, remnants of pre-Christian pagan sites, and in some cases, structures that even Roman records labeled forbidden by Saturn priests. These alignments were meant to channel energy, not spiritual, but cognitive. The idea that memory itself, when properly structured across architecture and death, could act like a transmission, or worse, a beacon. Soviet KGB files recovered in 1991 revealed that Stalin's men had attempted their own version of this after the war, using captured Nazi documents to create echo chambers beneath the Ural Mountains. The experiments failed, but they noted a peculiar side effect. Rats exposed to certain geometric configurations of stone and metal began displaying organized patterns, building nest circles, mirroring human behaviors, and freezing for hours in synchronized pulses. A psychological architect named Dr. Viktor Aramov, who later defected to the West, testified in a closed CIA session that Berlin wasn't a fortress, it was a keyhole. That line resurfaced again in a 2018 classified DARPA analysis when a civilian drone flew too close to a restricted Berlin construction zone and captured blurry images of a spiral tunnel. Perfectly smooth, curving with no visible start or end, covered in sigil-like markings not seen since Babylonian reliefs. Several frames showed motion blur, but nothing visibly present. Some theorists now believe that what lies beneath Berlin is a hybrid, a Cold War Frankenstein of Nazi myth, Soviet trauma, and Allied fear. A space so saturated in deliberate death, so architecturally precise in grief and ritual, that it functions less like a ruin and more like an unfinished sentence, a transmission awaiting its final word. Others go further. They claim the structure isn't dormant, that Berlin's architectural evolution above ground, the cranes, tunnels, glass corridors, is unknowingly feeding the design below, that every subway vibration, every scream beneath Alexanderplatz, every spilled blood droplet in that soil is still being collected, not by humans, but by the memory itself. Because if this was a machine and it was never turned off, then maybe the real question isn't what was it for, but when will it finish booting up? Today, Berlin thrives above ground, a city of art, technology, rebirth. Tourists flood the Brandenburg Gate. Students gather in parks built over old barracks. The U-Bahn hums beneath their feet like a forgotten hymn. But in the spaces between sound and silence, stories remain. A retired station technician, never named in public record, once described hearing rhythmic banging from a sealed tunnel beneath Geisenbrunnen. But when he opened the access panel, the sound stopped. Inside was only dust and a single shoe. An Allied boot model discontinued in 1951. Another man, a Turkish immigrant working night shift maintenance, quit his job after claiming he saw a man in a World War II Luftwaffe uniform walk through a brick wall. Police dismissed it, but 3 months later, that same worker was found dead. No sign of struggle, just slumped beside the exact wall where he swore he saw the man. His hands were stained with iron oxide, the same material used in Nazi-era air filtration units. In 2022, a viral video showed a group of teenagers exploring a sealed construction tunnel near Tempelhof. The footage ended with one girl screaming, "It's looking at us through the floor." Authorities claimed the video was faked, but quietly arrested the uploader for incitement of fear. Every attempt to publicly study Berlin's subterranean architecture has been shuttered, repurposed, or ignored. The official narrative insists nothing lies beneath but outdated wartime infrastructure, unstable, irrelevant, sealed. But those who've worked closest to the soil know better. They speak rarely, if ever. Some leave anonymous notes in graffiti, "Don't dig." Others simply move away, refusing to talk about what they once believed. And as for the Allied powers who once fought to stop the Nazi war machine, their silence has become even more disturbing than their past. Because for decades, they scoured Berlin's underground for weapons, documents, secrets. But the real horror wasn't what they expected. It was what they couldn't explain, what bled through time, what defied burial, what stared back through concrete and steel and ash with the patience of something older than ideology, older than war, older than man himself. And in the end, That is the terror the Soviets feared most. Not the weapons, not the plans, but the possibility that beneath Berlin, memory itself had been engineered into a form of life, and it's still listening,